King.
I have to say, periodically I get invited to speak to groups where I realize on the way in the door that every single person in the audience knows more about the subject than I do, but it's never held me back. So I realize that that's certainly the case today. And the first thing I want to say is thanks to everyone in this room, because your presence here is essential to creating the broadband infrastructure that we need. No government entity can do it by itself. No particular company can do it by itself. It's got to be a broad-based coalition of private, public, state, local, you name it, federal, and the fact that you're here is so important. I don't know about you, but in the past, when I was doing various different kinds of private sector and some public sector work, I was skeptical of conferences. I always thought, you know, I got to work, I got stuff to do, the phone's going to ring, who's going to answer it, what's going to go on, and I don't have time to go out. And then I gradually over time realized that businesses and individuals can learn so much. I guarantee that pretty much everybody in this room today is going to walk out with an idea that you heard from somebody else. And I've been accused of over-quoting Lincoln. Lincoln once said that every political thought he ever had came from the Declaration of Independence. In my case, every political thought I ever had came from Lincoln. But one of the things, he was once asked what he would do if he was given an hour to split a cord of wood. And his answer was, I'd spend the first 15 minutes sharpening my axe. And that's a pretty profound observation. Most of us would commence chopping, like crazy. Sharpening your axe makes the chopping a lot more efficient. And that's what you're doing today. You're sharpening your axe. You're learning things, thinking about things, getting ideas from one another, and that's what's so important. I'm sorry to be late. I had a meeting in Brunswick to announce that I'm running again for the U.S. Senate. And I wanted to be here, but they thought I ought to be there for that. But I did bring my notes in. Let the record show, I talked about what we've got to do in order to try to work better together in Washington and a whole series of things. But then the theme of the talk was there's more work to be done. And so I've got a list of things that there's more work to be done on, and I want you to know broadband is the #1 thing on the list. So I don't have to tell you why it's absolutely essential to the future of Maine. And particularly to the future of our rural areas. It's the essential infrastructure of the 21st century. You can't have a business in a rural area unless you have broadband connection. And you can't have people. And the most serious challenge that Maine faces over the next 20 years is workforce, is people, population. Here's a startling figure. When I was in Augusta less than 20 years ago, there were 17,000 kids per grade in Maine schools. 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. I remember particularly 7th grade, 17,000. That's the number of laptops that we bought. We were Steve Jobs' biggest customer there for a couple of years. 17,000 per grade. Today, that number is 13,000 and falling. That's not a blip. That's not a statistical aberration. That's a dangerous trend. And everywhere I go in the state, every business I talk to, every public sector, I was talking to the police chief in Auburn, Maine, had lunch at Simonis's, great hot dogs, by the way, yesterday, or I guess it was the day before. He said that 25 years ago, when they had an opening on the police force, they'd have 100 applicants. Today they have 10, and 3 of them are disqualified because of drugs. And that's a measure of what's happening everywhere, and I'm sure you're seeing the same thing. Whether it's in business, truck drivers, companies are desperate for truck drivers, for example, welders, engineers. I mean, it's all professions and skills that are necessary. And broadband is an essential tool to help us hold people and attract people here. Nobody's going to buy a house in Milo, Maine, if the realtor says, by the way, you can never have broadband. It's like telling a young couple, you have this a really nice house with good views, but there's no water. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So it's essential for just the interconnectedness of business, but it also for the kind of quality of life. It's something that you've just got to have. So how do we make it happen? What I said at the beginning is how we make it happen. And by the way, I want to thank you for making it happen. The work that you're doing, the work that this coalition is doing. If we didn't have you, we'd have to invent you. I mean, this is exactly the model, I think, that we have to have in order to make this all work. Because, as I said, no one entity can make this happen on its own. Just like I can't do things on my own without people like Adam Lackman, who's standing over there hiding. Adam's the hero of broadband. If any, well, I'll just share with you. You might want to write this down. This is King's secret of leadership. Ready? It's one sentence. Hire good people and take credit for what they do. It's worked for me for 25 years, and Adam is one of them. But it's got to be, in Washington, the new buzzword is all of government. I'm so sick of hearing that. You know, we're going to deal with the Russians with an all of government response. Whenever I hear that, I hear none of government. That means nobody's in charge. But it's got to be all sectors, and there's no single solution. It's not like this is the electric system where, you know, you put a wire to everybody's house and it's 120 or 240. There are different solutions, as you all know, according to the nature of the community, the nature of the geography, how the population density, all of those things have to be different solutions. I think the most promising thing, though, is public-private partnerships. And by the way, what we're doing isn't new. We have pretty short historical memories in this country. Mark Twain, though, said, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. I love that. Isn't that a great observation? It usually rhymes. And what we're doing now rhymes with rural electrification in the 30s. Because the issues were exactly the same. The utility said, we can't connect all those farms and those far-flung, the poles are too far apart, it's too expensive, it doesn't make any sense. And Roosevelt and the New Deal said, well, our rural areas are going to fall behind without electricity, so they invented rural electric co-ops, which, by the way, still exists. There was one down east co-op in Washington County. It goes back to the rural electric co-ops in the 30s. But they were always developing partnerships to make these things happen. And I'm a great advocate that communities have to think of broadband as infrastructure just like they think of a road. Why not bond for it? It's a 30-year asset or a 40-year asset. Why not bond for it like you do for a school or a road, not look on it as a one-time cash expenditure that's going to break your local budget, but think about that as a funding, as a partial funding mechanism, and the kind of project that's going on down in Sanford, which you know about, the extending the fiber from Biddeford and the three-ring binder over to Sanford, and then a kind of open, available for rent, if you will, for utilization by ISPs in the Sanford area. That's the kind of thing that I think we absolutely have to continue to do. It's going to require flexibility. It's going to require some visionary work on behalf of municipal officials because they aren't used to thinking of broadband in this way, but I think everybody, and there are many communities who are doing that. We've even got help from the Boston Post Road project. That's pretty cool. Is someone here from Boston Post Road? Yeah, they were going to do 5 projects around the country. We convinced them that there were only 2 states in the union. Maine got 3 of the 5 projects. I'm not quite sure how we pulled that off, but they're fascinating projects in different areas of the state involving different technologies. working with the electric utilities in a couple of cases. So again, we've just got to keep thinking about how can we do this, and what are the best ways to do it. So here are some things that I think, from my point of view, I'm trying to think about. One, the federal response has to be stronger. There's all kinds of talk in Washington about infrastructure projects. It's got to include, I keep telling the leadership, it's got to include broadband. Just like a bridge, just like a port, just like a highway, it's got to include broadband. That's number one. Plus, we need better data. I don't know if you're aware of this issue, but the FCC is making decisions on what I consider inadequate data as to what really is out there in terms of accessibility and speed. And then, of course, funding. We managed to get, I think, 600 million, wasn't it, Adam? 600 million in the omnibus spending bill that went through. We're going to try to keep on that, trying to get that to as many parts of the country as possible in an equitable way. The Department of Agriculture is going to be a partner. There are all kinds of opportunities using USDA, rural development funding, but we got to keep the money. Some money has to keep coming from Washington. Secondly, everything's got to be public-private partnerships, in my view. I mean, there may be cases where the population density is such that it makes sense to do entirely private sector, but by and large, I think it's going to be public-private. We also need to take advantage of the three-ring binder, which is an amazing asset that every state doesn't have. It's just, you know, it pretty much covers the state. The problem is, as you all know, there aren't many off-ramps. And so it's the middle and final mile that we've got to deal with. But boy, are we ahead of the game having the backbone here. And that's a huge advantage to us that we have to continue to take advantage of. So those are some of the things that you know, we're going to keep working on. I can't make predictions about what the funding will be. I can tell you that this is a bipartisan priority. I started about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, Shelley Capito, who's a Republican senator from West Virginia, and I started something called the Rural Broadband Caucus. And we now have, I don't know, 25 or 30 members from places like North Dakota, Arkansas, Montana, Washington, the places you would expect. And we ought to have help, and I'll tell you why. This is an interesting little tidbit about the U.S. Senate. 18 United States senators represent a majority of Americans because of the way the Senate works. Maine has 2 senators, California has 2 senators. But isn't that interesting? What that tells you is the Senate is essentially a rural body. Idaho, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, North Dakota, South Dakota, and I teased my friend Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota. I don't know, there was a joke that went around the internet a couple of years ago that the Queen was declaring null and void the American Revolution. She said she was taking back the colonies, although it said at the end, Her Majesty doesn't fancy North Dakota. That just struck me as funny. So, thank goodness it didn't say Maine. But those are the kinds of things that we need to do, and I just want you to know that this is, I mean, I'm not kidding, it's a number one on my list, and it's one of the things. Adam works on this practically full time, and he's up here quite a bit. So you've got to let me know what we can do on the federal level and how I can help with my sort of convening authority up here. And I should have mentioned, through your work, Maine has taken some great strides in pole attachment issues, which is a real problem nationwide, and my understanding is we're about to enter a new world here where that's going to not be as much of a problem as it has been, and I think it's been largely due to your good work with the PUC. So those are the thoughts, but there's no more important work going on in Maine right now than what you're doing, and I just want to commit myself to continuing to work with you and do whatever we can to make it happen. I guess since I mentioned Lincoln, I'll end with a Lincoln quote. because we're involved in change. Even broadband in the last 5 years has changed. I mean, you think about what we were thinking about was, 10 down, 2 up was cool, That was not that long ago. Everything is changing, the technology is changing, the rules are changing, the economics are changing, so this is a tough period. And it's hard to know how and when to make the right investments and what the long-term future is. So Abraham Lincoln knew a thing or two about change. And on December 2nd, 1862, he went up to Congress because Congress was dealing with the Civil War as a kind of politics as usual thing. And he was trying to get them out of that, to shake them up a bit and understand that this was a new, totally different situation, that it took new kinds of solutions. So Lincoln ended his speech with what I think is the best definition, the best guideline for how to deal with change that I've ever encountered. Here's what Abraham Lincoln said: "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty. Therefore, we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." I love that. We must disenthrall ourselves. We have to think in new and different ways, and then we shall save our country and the state of Maine. Thank you all very much. I'd be glad to try a couple of questions. Way in the back. You're going to have to shout.
Thank you. I didn't expect to be doing this, but the dominant source of funding for broadband from the federal level is the Universal Service Administrative Company. It's about a $10 billion fund. About half of that goes to the Connect America Fund. It seems to me, having been on the board of directors of that organization and its treasurer for 9 years, that the Connect America Fund largely supports outdated technology and very limited recipients as providers. And I would think that would be a good priority for seeking change in the way the federal government supports broadband.
And I agree. I think we've got to look at the structure, how it goes out, what the formulas are, because we can make some bets on outdated technology and wonder where we are 5 years from now. So that's definitely, that is part of. I've learned that there's a hierarchy of what I can do in Washington. Amending the Constitution is hard. Solving immigration is hard, but poking the bureaucracy is something I can do. Actually, I have a GPI's text number. But here's where you can help me. All of you can help me in what to advocate for. In other words, if we're talking about, well, we don't like the current structure, what should come next and how we should structure it? Please be in touch with Adam and with my office. So I have the outline of where we want to get. Okay, please. Thank you, sir.
Do you see the net neutrality debate impacting broadband, and what are our options for addressing that?
Yes, I think, I don't know if there's a direct connection, but I think it's one of the most important issues we have. I'm proud to say that the Senate 2 weeks ago repealed the repeal by a vote of 53. Now, it was every member of the Democratic caucus plus Susan Collins John Kennedy, Republican senator from Louisiana, and Lisa Murkowski. And I'll tell you, the lobbying was fierce. If you watch the Senate floor, people were surrounding Lisa and Kennedy. Susan had announced her position, which, by the way, she deserves real credit for. It's easy to stand up to your opponents. It's hard to stand up to your friends, and that's what she did. Now the battle shifts to the House, and we have to convince our 2 House members, but more importantly, I think, many of you are involved in national organizations of some kind or another, associations. You have friends and associates in other states. This is only going to be won if it becomes a wildfire grassroots issue, which it should. I mean, everybody, it's a dreadful, what the FCC did was a dreadful policy. And I think we have a chance, but it won't happen if it's just everybody says, oh, well, I hope they vote our way. It's going to have to take, thousands of emails and letters and calls and millions, actually. And I think it could happen because it will come up in the House sometime in the next month or two. And that's where it goes. Now, there's a possibility of a legislative solution. And in my judgment, the best time to do a legislative solution is probably now, where everybody's uncertain about the outcome. And that way we can negotiate something. And I talked to John Thune, the chair of the Commerce Committee. He's in charge of it. He was lobbying hard against the vote the other day, but I think now he's in a position where he's going to have to make perhaps some concessions to get a bill to solve it. And it would be better if it was solved by good legislation, so it doesn't bounce back and forth according to who's in charge of the FCC. But the main thing, my main message is, be in touch with members of the House here in Maine, but also around the country if you have colleagues that can do that. And I think it does relate to the broadband issue. It relates to everything connected to the internet. I mean, it's again, remember about history rhyming? This is the railroads in 1886. The railroads were the carriers in the 1800s. They were all powerful, and they got into having preferential rates. And if you were a big company, you got faster service, and you got more cars, and you got special deals. It's exactly analogous to what's potentially going to happen with the internet. And lo and behold, Congress, after a struggle in 1886, passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which regulated the railroads, not in their rates so much, but in their fairness and openness to every customer, which is really what we're talking about. Nobody's talking about regulating rates under net neutrality. We're talking about just keeping the whole thing open to the entrepreneur in the basement in Wittapitlock, as well as General Motors or Amazon. And then it took about 20 years until Teddy Roosevelt was president to really make the Interstate Commerce Act work. But the history is fascinating. The parallel is almost exactly the same as what we're facing now. And I think it's a crucial turning point for whether the internet is going to be the engine of innovation that it has been in the future. What else? I promise not to be so long-winded next time, sorry.
Given that the Senate is largely rural, and there's a lot of interest, particularly among all the members of the Senate, basically all millionaires, they understand in a deep way what broadband brings to their communities, maybe more than some rural farmer might. What opportunity for bipartisanship is there?
I think
Bipartisanship leveraged by this.
I think there's a lot. I mean, I don't see this as a net neutrality for some reason that I really don't understand became a partisan issue, but broadband I don't think is. I'm just trying to think. John Bozeman of Arkansas, Republican, was one of the first person to join our caucus. Shelley Capito of West Virginia. Mike Rounds of South Dakota. These are all Republicans. Heidi Heitkamp, Democrat of North Dakota. So I don't see this as a partisan issue, and it came pretty well out of the budget negotiations as a nonpartisan issue. I prefer nonpartisan to bipartisan, because I'm the third guy in that. I'm trying to educate him, but it's not, it's a but yeah, I don't see this as a partisan issue. It affects everybody, particularly those rural states. I'm also the chair of the Semiconductor Caucus in the Senate, and my co-chair is Jim Risch of Idaho, who's one of the most conservative Republican senators, but he and I work together on that because they have a big semiconductor center in Boise, and of course we have it in South Portland. So in some ways the partisanship is worse than you think, but in other ways it's not as bad. There are a lot of things that are going on there. People are working together and really trying to make it work. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.